Well, I've been holding off talking about this whole situation with Saudi Arabia getting their oil, I guess not refinery, but like processing plant or oil field blown to bits, because we haven't had any accurate or consistent information on it. I've been hearing things from all sorts of different directions, and I was hoping that maybe we would have a more clear picture today, but we still don't. I feel like we know less now than we did, in the immediate aftermath on Saturday. Because at first, what we heard is that the Houthis had attacked the Saudis, which again, big whoop. The Saudis have been at war in Yemen for, what is it, like 7 years now or something. I keep saying 7 years, but it might be longer. And they shouldn't be shocked that that's coming back to bite them. I mean, when you're constantly, shooting at some folks, don't be shocked when they shoot back. But the story that we've been hearing in the last couple days since that, even though the Houthis claimed responsibility for the attack, is that the U.S. is saying, well, essentially that the Houthis didn't do it. There seems to be an accusation that these attacks were launched from somewhere in the east rather than somewhere to the south. And so we were hearing that maybe these attacks were launched by the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, which are, the big Shiite militia group there. That has been fighting, ISIS and all the Sunni groups there. So it makes sense that they wouldn't like Saudi Arabia, and of course they're, big buddies with Iran, who doesn't like Saudi Arabia. So they seemed like potential suspects. Of course, there's just a call that has been transcribed and published published in part by Reuters. Between the Prime Minister of Iraq and Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State. And apparently Pompeo and the Prime Minister of Iraq both have information that pretty much says, hey, the missile was not launched from Iraq. Iraqis didn't do it. So obviously, then, if the U.S. is saying, no, the Houthis didn't launch these missiles, or whatever they were. We don't even know if they were missiles. It might have been a drone attack. Because some people are reporting it that way. Other people are saying that there was a cruise missile, and then there are people saying, well, no, it couldn't have been a cruise missile because a cruise missile would have done more damage. Because the attack on this refinery was apparently a very pinpoint strike. It took out a very specific part, or sorry, not the refinery, the oil field. It took out a very specific part of their operation that essentially, crippled their whole process and will be very difficult to rebuild. This was kind of a choke point in the whole, in Saudi Aramco's entire business, which, Saudi Aramco is the Saudi oil company. This one attack has pretty much cut off 50% of their entire capacity, meaning that now the Saudis can only produce, oil at half the rate that they could before. Now, considering that the Saudis have long backed off how much they could actually produce. They weren't producing at full capacity, which is kind of how these oil states work, because they have the OPEC cartel, and they decide how much they're going to produce. So that tells me that they have extra capacity. So I don't know necessarily why this one thing getting taken out, removes 50. Like, are they going to have to cut back 50% from their current production, or is it 50% of their total capacity? That really hasn't been explained yet. Because I would be surprised if the Saudis really if they couldn't produce somewhere close to what they're already producing, considering how much they hold back their production process. But if this does end up being something that is severely crippling to the Saudis' ability to export oil, and if this really does take, quite a few months to repair, well, then we're looking at, what may be a very serious supply-side shock in the oil markets, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 70s, when OPEC intentionally restricted the supply of oil and drove the price up astronomically. That's what killed, all the great big American cars and, the big block V8s and stuff. It was OPEC. So that's why people started producing those smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. As we speak, Brent crude is up about 10%, I think, which is well off the highs, which was about 18%. At the open, people, it kind of panic bid at the open, but since then it has sold off quite a bit, because I guess people are, I guess we have Saudi oil optimism. You've heard of trade talk optimism. People are optimistic, I guess, that the Saudis will be able to get this oil field back up and running at some point. So the real question here is then, for me, will the U.S. end up finally decide to start their long-awaited war in Iraq. Or, I mean, in Iran. Sorry. Wrong Middle East country. We've already destroyed Iraq. Now, I find it ironic that this great opportunity for the war hawks to finally get their war with Iran came just as John Bolton has departed the White House. Were he in charge, in part or in full, this is certainly the kind of event that he would use as an opportunity to invade that particular Middle East country. But as I've said in the past, I think that Trump and Pompeo are a little more reluctant to invade Iran, at least not this far out from the election, because they know how quickly U.S. Wars in the Middle East can turn bad, and that the headlines can reverse, and instead of the U.S. looking strong and standing up to someone that the media describes to be as some kind of bully, the U.S. just ends up looking like fools again, like they do in Iraq and Afghanistan. And since Trump and Pompeo both have electoral ambitions to various degrees, they do not want to have another bad Middle East war on their record. They want to have, if anything, I would say that Trump probably would be okay with a war with Iran going into, starting when going into the 2020 election. But this far out, I don't think it makes sense for him. Because it's right at the start of the war that, presidents get their boost in approval. It's never, well into the war. When the war is going on, nobody likes you. But when you start the war and you're just looking tough, and all the boys are shipping off, and and the women are waving to them on the docks, that's when people are excited and happy, or at least that's how it's been historically. Who knows? Maybe people have finally woken up and they'll realize at the start of the war that things are not going to go well, and that this is a terrible idea. But this is all very fluid. At this point, I still think that Trump's language regarding Iran and this whole situation is posturing. I think it's tough talk. I'm starting to think that, because the general suspicion of most, critiques of Washington is that, everyone there is a war hawk, and that everyone wants, any excuse to go to war at all ever. If that were the case, I think we'd already be at war with Iran. Because this is as good of an excuse by Washington standards as really you'd need. I think that if the president really was this, and Pompeo were, bloodthirsty war hawks like John Bolton, we would have already been seeing the videos of the Marines landing on the beaches of Persia, and we would see images of bombs falling in Tehran from the B-52s. But maybe, just perhaps, Trump and Pompeo are a little more reluctant and don't want to necessarily end up being the next, George W. Bush and Colin Powell. Even if only for purely cynical political reasons. It's important to keep in mind at times like this that peace is still popular. People don't like to be at war. People don't like to hear about Americans dying. Particularly if it's Americans dying to defend a absolute monarchy that had something to do with 9/11, though what exactly our government isn't really willing to tell us, but pretty much everyone admits that the Saudis had some hand in it, but that's all classified. I think that if we get into a war with Iran, a comparatively, less evil government than Saudi Arabia, one that is a little still backward, but a little more Western than Saudi Arabia, I think it would be very difficult for Trump to try and justify that on the campaign trail. I think Trump knows that, and I think Pompeo may know it even better, since Pompeo, from what I've been hearing, wants to run for president in 2024. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.